Good evening. I'm Peter Carmichael, professor of history here at Gettysburg College. I'm also the director of the CWI Institute. It's my pleasure to introduce Barbara Krauthamer. Barbara is associate professor of history at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, where she teaches courses on antebellum U.S. history, slavery, emancipation, and Native American history. Her first book, I have right in front of me, her first book entitled Black Slaves, Indian Masters, Slavery, Emancipation, and Citizenship in the Native American South, published by the University of North Carolina Press. This book details the untold story of the enslavement by Choctaw and Chickasaw Indians in the 18th and 19th centuries. Barbara has also co-authored a photographic history of slavery, emancipation, and freedom, published in 2013, published by Temple University Press, and it is also for sale in our bookstore. Tonight, she will be speaking about her recent work, and the talk is entitled Envisioning Emancipation, Black Americans, and the End of Slavery. Please welcome Barbara.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for staying this late into the night. Thank you for staying awake. Thank you, Peter, for the invitation and the introduction. And Allison, who has made sure that everything happened seamlessly from Massachusetts to Gettysburg. Tonight I want to talk to you about the book that I co-authored with Deborah Willis. Deborah Willis, if you don't know who she is the leading scholar in the history of African-American photography, a MacArthur Award winner, just a brilliant woman and a dear friend of mine. And she and I were colleagues for many years, and over the years had many conversations about photographs of enslaved people that we came across in the course of doing other research projects. And I would say to her, you're the photography scholar. Explain to me why I've never read anything about the history of the photography of slavery and emancipation. And she would say to me, I don't know, you're the historian of slavery and emancipation, you tell me. And so for truly a decade, she and I would sort of, go out to lunch, go out to dinner, have a drink, and show each other these photographs. And then one day we said, there may actually be a book project here. So the book indeed turned out to be Envisioning Emancipation. Our question in this project, and in one that we're just starting to get to work on in the upcoming months, was what did freedom look like? Right? We know a lot about the legal history and the political history of the debates over slavery, of the Civil War, and of Reconstruction, but we wanted to really take this question to a visual perspective and ask sort of how was freedom, emancipation represented, and how did African Americans represent themselves? Really, the heart of our project was a history of African Americans through their own eyes, right? How they saw themselves and represented themselves. At the more scholarly level, we were curious about using photographs and seeing them, right? Reading the visual text, as it were, as both artifacts, right? As both sort of the relic of the past, but also as historical sources on emancipation and its legacies. And obviously, the most lasting and important legacy for our purpose this weekend is the history of Reconstruction. And so we were curious to see what we could do with these photographs to understand that history, how it was narrated and how it was preserved by African Americans, and also how African Americans were represented in a visual telling of that history of emancipation and its legacies. So what I'm going to do tonight, right, so there's an illuminated copy of the Emancipation Proclamation. What I'll do tonight is take you through some of the images that we discuss and write about in the book. There's some that I'll just show you quickly and won't linger on. I should say, as we were putting this book together, we looked through thousands and thousands of images from archives both in the United States and abroad. And early on, our editor said, you can include 75 images. And we thought, well, that's just never, ever going to work. Because we came to the editor with about 250, and they said, we can do 75. So we went back to our pile of 250, and we got it down maybe to 200, something like that. And we went back to the editor and said, 75 is not going to work. And they said, okay, 100. And we said 200. And we went back and forth. And so then finally we got to the point where we just didn't tell them how many we said. We were sort of hoping that they wouldn't count. And clearly no one counted too carefully because the book came out. Some of the images I'll show you tonight are in the book, and some are not in the book. When we started and we were thinking about what does freedom look like, we thought it was important to think about what does slavery look like in the history of photography. Much of the scholarship on the history of photography, especially in the US context, argues that photography, when it arrived in the United States from France in the late 1840s, early 1850s, had a really profound democratizing effect on American culture. Right, that the technology became relatively affordable relatively quickly, and that many Americans, great and modest, could afford to have their pictures made. As we thought about it, we thought this line of argument and interpretation didn't fit at all with what we were seeing in the photographs of enslaved people. And so we begin the book by thinking about slavery and photography, and really arguing quite strenuously that the history of photography for African Americans was not one about this democratic expansion of American culture in the antebellum period. So we began with some of the more famous images that you've probably seen, daguerreotypes that were made in 1850, which is an interesting year that we'll get back to, of enslaved Africans and their American-born children. Daguerreotypes that were made in South Carolina under the direction of a Harvard scientist who wanted to try to document his theories of polygenesis, right? That there were separate orders of human beings and that there were separate creations of separate species. And so he had a series of these daguerreotypes made. You can see, I don't have a laser pointer, but you can see on the left-hand side of the screen there that there are these handwritten labels. This one says Jack, Driver, Guinea, Plantation of B.F. Taylor, from South Carolina. So there are a number of pictures like that that show both African enslaved people and then their American-born progeny, again with the attempt of using photography to present a visual image of human difference and human hierarchy. So there are others that have women with their breasts exposed. Many scholars have argued, right, that this is really part of the scientific project and wasn't intended as sort of a pornographic endeavor. And I would suggest that in fact the two are very closely intertwined, right? That forcing black women to strip and reveal their breasts for the camera was both part of this quote-unquote scientific endeavor, but that in and of itself was very much based in ideas about black women's hypersexuality, lack of morality, lack of dignity, and lack of respectability. This image is actually the one that really got us thinking we need to pull all of these pictures together and do a book. This is an image that's a wanted notice for a runaway slave, a woman named Dolly. One of the first things that caught our attention, of course, was that there is a carte de visite, right, a photograph attached to the top of this handwritten notice, which automatically raised a number of questions for us of why did this woman's master have her picture, right? What prompted him to have a photograph of this enslaved woman made? We still don't know the answer, though we have some theories. In the text of the notice, he announces that Dolly has run away from the yard behind his house in Augusta. It's important to note the date of Dolly's escape. She escapes April 7th, 1863, right? So after the Emancipation Proclamation, but clearly she is liberating herself, right? Her master surmises, and I do love this, right? He describes her body, and in this way, in both his written words and his presentation of her photograph, really conveys that power to own and control and look at and proclaim who she is. So he says she's shy and she hesitates when spoken to, but that she has very nice teeth. He says that she must have been enticed away by a white man because she's never changed owners and is a stranger to the city. And so, of course, he tells this narrative, right, where he never changed owners, as if that would have been her choice, right? We know, of course, it would not have been her choice. But so her master, this very prominent South Carolinian, Louis Manigault, creates this narrative of sort of domestic harmony and bliss. When you delve into the Manigault papers, the overseer reports upon investigation of Dolly's disappearance. And I should note, of the hundreds of slaves that Louis Manigault owned, many of them, dozens of them, escaped over the years, both men and women. And of all of those who escaped, Dolly was the only one who was never captured. She was the only one who was never returned to his possession. When Manigault's overseer interrogated the other enslaved people in the household, they told a very different story that did not involve a white man enticing her away, but they in fact told a story of a free black man who worked at a hotel across the street, who had been coming around the yard late at night to court Dolly, and said that the two of them had run off together. So Dolly for us was really the first image of what freedom looks like, but also what those legacies of emancipation look like, right? Of autonomy and self-control and self-determination. But interestingly also of a certain kind of post-Reconstruction nostalgia on the part of former slaveholders. The reason the document and the photographs survive is that Louis Manigault built a tremendous scrapbook, right, to what in his mind were the glory days of slavery, in which he pasted the bills of sale, right, the advertisements for auctions where he purchased people, the receipts for the money he paid to buy people, and he included this, right, and he writes this sort of heartfelt lament that he never saw her again, which raised some questions about, again, why he had her photograph made in the first place. One of the things we found out that we had not known before doing this research was that some slaveholders had photographs made of the enslaved people they owned to present a positive defense of slavery, to present slavery as a benign institution, to present themselves as benevolent masters who clothed and fed other human beings, if that's the mark of humanity. And then often there were images, right, such as this one by Thomas Easterly, where white families would pose with an enslaved woman, usually. We've seen some poses with enslaved boys, not so many with men, as a way of showing off your wealth and status and prestige and presenting the enslaved person as a favorite pet or valuable object. We suspect that if the photograph of Dolly was not one of perhaps a love interest for Manigault, that he wanted a photograph of a woman that he desired, we suspect that it was probably a photograph more like this one, where Dolly is holding a Manigault baby on her lap. And we've looked at the timing of her escape and the timing of the birth of the Manigault children, and there would have been an older infant in the household at this time. So it's entirely possible, and that would explain then, while I go back, oops, come on, why the photograph is cropped, right, and why you can't see the bottom 2/3 of that image, right, if she is holding the child. We spent a fair amount of time then after sort of establishing this foundation for the ways in which African Americans were represented, the way in which that history of slavery was told by other people, to looking at how both African Americans and white Americans involved in the anti-slavery movement represented their appeal, made their anti-slavery cause. So we have images like this, a lapel pin that has a daguerreotype of a white hand and a black hand clasping. Of course, we had to spend some time with, and a fair amount of time with Frederick Douglass, who wrote extensively about photography and about the power of self-representation. Wrote about the power for African Americans to be able to present themselves as they saw themselves, right, as they experienced themselves and each other. And so for Douglass then, it was really important to be able to control his own image. Douglass was terribly dismayed, as many of you probably know. When the early editions of his narratives were published, he was terribly dismayed at the artist's renderings of him that were included in those early editions, because he felt that the artist had represented him as a beast and not as a dignified intellectual man. So for Douglass, posing for these portraits in very classical style was a way not only of representing himself, but about making a larger political argument about African American humanity. For African Americans, being able to create their own images, and for free African Americans, being able to purchase and acquire the images of prominent African Americans in the antebellum era was terrifically important, both politically and personally. Sojourner Truth, of course, another well-known abolitionist and women's rights activist who, like Douglass, embraced the power of the photograph to not only represent herself, right, to present herself as a refined and dignified older woman, not as a battered former slave, right? So she curls her hand. You can't see her hand that's been injured. But she also, of course, sold her photograph to support herself. And as we were doing the research for the book, one of the things that we came across were letters to Sojourner Truth written by free black women from places like Brooklyn, asking to purchase a copy of her photograph and saying how tremendously important it was and how meaningful it was to be able to support the anti-slavery cause on the wages of a domestic servant by purchasing this photograph. And in one letter, a woman writes to Truth and says, I wish I had enough money to buy a copy of your picture for every woman in my family. But I don't, so I'm going to buy one and I'm going to share it with every woman in my family. So that you know and that we know that we're bound together in this fight. We thought it was very important to include photographs by African Americans. So we included a series of photographs by the photographer Augustus Washington, an African American man from New Jersey. This, of course, is John Brown. We wanted to spend some time back to this freedom question of thinking about what freedom looked like for free African Americans. You heard in the previous talk how northern states eventually stripped free African Americans of the state right to vote in their states. So freedom eroded in many instances for free African Americans, and for some, like Urias McGill pictured here, freedom looked like exile. McGill left the United States under duress, under protest. I don't think he wanted to leave necessarily, but he was part of a group, right, that moved to Liberia, believing that he could never achieve full freedom and full humanity in the country of his birth. And so after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law, after 1850, freedom looked like exile, right, like another wave of dislocation. So this is another photograph by Augustus Washington of Sarah McGill Russworm. Her husband, of course, was John Russworm, the famous newspaper man who started the first African-American newspaper in the United States. The masthead of Freedom's Journal said, if we do not speak for ourselves, who will speak for us? Right? And so again, that sense of autonomy and self-determination. One of our favorite pictures of thinking what freedom looked like is that we know that for many people, for many African Americans, freedom looked like that self-liberation moment. So this is an image from a conference protesting the Fugitive Slave Law from the late summer of 1850. It might be hotter in here than it was there in August. This is a photograph of an event organized by Douglass and Gerrit Smith, who's the tall man in the center standing behind Douglass. They anticipated 50 people would show up. Over 200 people showed up, so they moved outside to the orchards. So the photograph is also historically important because it's one of the earliest examples of outdoor photography, right, where you can see the crowd in the foreground and then the panel of speakers in the background. The photograph is also important to us because it showcases two women who had attempted to escape from slavery. Mary and Emily Edmondson had attempted to escape in 1848 from Washington, D.C. They were captured. Their father, Paul Edmondson, made his way from Washington to Brooklyn to meet with the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher to plead with him and say, you know, if these were your daughters, and the slave trading firm Price and Birch was bragging about taking Mary and Emily Edmondson to North Carolina to sell them as concubines, right, as fancy girls. And Paul Edmondson makes his way to Brooklyn and says, how would you feel if these were your daughters that someone was bragging about selling as concubines, as sex slaves? And the Edmondson sisters are then, quote unquote, redeemed, they're purchased and given their freedom, which is really a concept that I think we all should stop and think about what that meant, right, to be given your freedom, as opposed to simply being able to possess yourself and possess your freedom. And the accounts of this convention in upstate New York describe how beautifully and powerfully the Edmondson sisters spoke to the crowd, and how it was their speeches and their songs that really moved the crowd to tears in many instances. And we thought it was important to include them to really highlight the role of everyday people, and particularly everyday black women, in that fight against slavery. The bulk of our study looked at the Civil War and that moment of emancipation, and then the legacies of emancipation. So I'll go quickly through some of these images, which I'm sure are familiar to you. We wanted to include this one because it shows an African-American man driving the wagon of a Civil War photographer. One of the things that we know is that photography boomed as an industry during the Civil War. And then after the Civil War, the number of African-American photographers proliferated as well. And one of the things that we suspect happened is that many African-Americans learned the trade, learned the skill and the art of photography by training on the ground, quite literally, with Civil War itinerant photographers during the war. So we have a number of portraits that are familiar to you. Here's an image of Price and Birch of that slave trading firm. One of the things that we were interested in is how these photographs were received by Northerners, how this idea of black freedom was represented visually and then presented to a Northern viewing audience. And for the most part, what we found is that freedom, the idea of emancipation, was represented as a non-event, right? That black people would remain at work on plantations. I will come back to this one in a second. We'll go with this one then. The black men, this is an interesting one, right? This is a picture made by a New Hampshire photographer of contrabands, those runaway slaves, people who liberated themselves on the U.S. Vermont in Port Royal in the Sea Islands. When you look at this photograph, thinking about it from the perspective of the formerly enslaved men and boys on this, it's hard not to think about the Middle Passage, about these men clustered together on the deck of a ship. Right? One of the things that we know from reading the letters of African Americans who made transatlantic voyages during the antebellum period and after was that they really had this sense that these ocean voyages were steeped with history that they couldn't escape. Right? That history that was really embedded in them. There's a companion image to this that I don't have that shows the officers of the U.S. Vermont. And, you know, in that image, they're all wearing their uniforms and they're standing. Right? They're very dignified. There's distance between each man. And so it creates a very different image of who are the officers and who are the crew and laborers. And it creates a very different image then of what free black men represent, right, in the context of thinking about the future of the nation. This is a picture of Contraband Yard that depicts women and children. And one of the things as we look at these photographs of contrabands, which are often reproduced in history texts, is that we thought it was important to ask who's not pictured. Who didn't make it to the camps? Who was sold away? In the previous talk, we saw those advertisements in the newspapers that people placed looking for lost relatives that had been sold away. And so in this moment of Jubilee, in these early moments of emancipation, of reconfiguring what the nation looks like, at the individual level, at the family level, at the community level, for African Americans, that Jubilee of freedom was also tinged with a sense of loss, right? Of family members who were gone. I should also point out that in the foreground of this image, if you can see it, is blurry because there are children playing. And so we have a number of images that have these blurry spots because children don't stand still. This is another image about sort of how emancipation and the future of the nation, right, in the wake of black freedom, what it would look like. And you'll notice here that the African Americans on this plantation are literally anchored on a bed of cotton, right? So clearly it's a staged photograph. Right, the photographer has arranged this tarp on the ground, piled it with raw cotton, and then former slaves are seated in the cotton. Right, so again, emancipation comes across visually as a non-event. Right, black people remain on the plantation, remain anchored and tied to that plantation labor. I'm sure you're all familiar with this image, right, and the power of so many of these images. One of the things that we sought to do with our research, though, was on the one hand to really recognize and respect the history that the image tells us, but to also offer us some alternative thoughts If you look at the Harper's Weekly in which this photograph is reproduced as an etching, there's a companion piece. Has anyone seen it? This is actually part of a triptych. Yeah, some people are nodding, right? So you know what the triptych is. It's how he comes into the camp in tatters. It's this picture of the scarred back. And then what's the third picture? The third picture is him in his Union uniform. That is not the image that circulates today in our popular culture, right? It's not the image of a dignified soldier, right? It's the image of a battered body. And so there's something about the currency of these battered bodies that we thought was powerful, but we also thought it was worth really taking a moment and stopping to ask, why are the images of battered black bodies so compelling in ways that images of beautiful, refined, intellectual, dignified African Americans are not perceived as so compelling? So this is the image that circulates. We have a number of other familiar pictures, portraits of of soldiers, some of whom were formerly enslaved. Again, showcasing that idea of patriotism, dignity, and manhood. We also, again, really wanted to showcase the role of women in that fight for freedom. So this is Susie King Taylor. This is one of many people's favorites because it tells a different story, and it'll get me then to this question about legacies. It suggests the importance of families in African American communities, right? That soldiers are fighting not just for themselves, not just for their country, but really quite literally, in many cases, for their families and for their communities. It's also a picture that tells us a lot about people's perceptions of their beauty and of their dignity. Likewise, this is a marriage portrait of two former slaves from Maryland, and this is their wedding portrait. So again, that idea of the importance of marriage and of legalizing what could not be legal under the laws of slavery as a really critical mark, a very personal assertion of one's freedom. So thinking about the legacies of emancipation, not Reconstruction politics so much, but how the idea and the experience of emancipation stayed with Americans, stayed with African American communities and culture long after the moment of emancipation. One of the things that we wanted to do was sort of move beyond the twin poles of Reconstruction's promise, right, of this moment of political participation, or this moment of the unfinished revolution, right? This is Benjamin Singleton, who would lead the exodus out of the Deep South to the Midwest, to places like Kansas, in the face of so much domestic violence and terrorism directed against former slaves and free African Americans. So we wanted to think about what were some of the other legacies. In some cases, the legacies were continued military service for African American men, and in that ironic fight for freedom of opening the West, as it were, to U.S. settlement, which necessarily then pitted African Americans against Native Americans in those wars in the West, right? And so freedom, again, being this incredibly complicated and contested idea in the U.S. context. This is a great one from Richmond. It's a photograph of an Emancipation Day celebration. And I think we need to pause for a second, and I will say again the location, and you can think about why this is such a powerful image. It's an Emancipation Day celebration, 1888, in Richmond, Virginia. Right? The heart of the Confederacy. It's in Richmond, Virginia. It's 3 generations of one family. So generations that span those born into slavery and those born into freedom. If you look in the center, towards the back, there's a woman holding a baby, right? A young infant. So a child that was obviously born in 1888, right? This new generation of African Americans born into freedom. And of course you can see the banner with Lincoln hanging from the center. So this real recognition of Lincoln, but also this recognition of black families, of black property ownership. Because they're standing in front of a store that they own. So people who had been property becoming property owners as one of the most important legacies of emancipation. This is an Emancipation Day celebration also in Richmond, Virginia. This time in 1905. In the previous talk, we heard a lot about lynching and violence during and after Reconstruction. So in 1905, this period that's the height of lynching of African Americans, not just men, but also women, right? This height of violence and terror directed specifically at those African Americans in particular who were politically active, politically engaged, economically successful, outspoken. And here is the African American community of Richmond, right, having an Emancipation Day celebration in Richmond in 1905, right, claiming that public space, right, to celebrate not just their emancipation, but their right to take public space, to celebrate the end of slavery, right, their right to assert African American political culture and social culture with dignity and pride in public. Emancipation Day celebrations, as you know, were common across the country. This is a picture from Austin, Texas from 1900. Again, I think really showcasing formerly enslaved people as beautiful and as dignified and as refined individuals. In this case, also as landowners who purchased the land where the celebrations occurred. One of the things that we write about in this book, and have continued to write about, is thinking about how the experiences of slavery and emancipation, the experiences of Reconstruction violence, were really carried in people's bodies, right? And so that as we look at these photographs as historical documents, that one of the questions we kept coming back to in terms of thinking about what does freedom look like is who's not in the picture? Who's not pictured, right? What was the loss that accompanied that moment of freedom? Right? What was the loss of family members who were never found again? So this is a picture from 1916 of a woman named Elizabeth Berkeley and a woman named Sadie Thompson. And again, that sense of graceful refinement, but that doesn't tell us about the conditions that brought them together. It doesn't tell us about how they carried their memories or their experiences in their bodies, but it does tell us how they went into 1916 into a reunion of former slaves. This was an event in Washington, D.C. that was designed to bring together people who had been enslaved, basically to celebrate their survival, right, in 1916. And newspapers up and down the East Coast wrote about this event, right, wrote about how local members in Washington, D.C. donated their cars so the elderly wouldn't have to walk, but could drive to the events. So again, this sense that moment of emancipation continued through Reconstruction and well after, right? That sense of people carrying those memories with them and wanting to really have those memories and that experience of enslavement and emancipation be part of the political culture in which they lived. So we have a number of images that, again, in the interest of time, because I know I'm standing between you and the ice cream at this point. These are later emancipation images. You can see the American flag here on this younger couple's horse. This is an image, again, from Virginia of an older woman selling ice cream at an emancipation celebration. These are the Fisk Jubilee Singers. And again, in all of these images, one of the things that's tremendously important to notice is that as African Americans are crafting their own visual legacies of emancipation, the emphasis is really on refinement and dignity. Right? It's not on their battered bodies, right? It's not on the abuse and dehumanization that they suffered, but it's on their sense of self, right? Their sense of themselves as achieving intellectuals and sophisticated individuals. This is Mary McLeod Bethune and the children at her school. This, of course, is Booker T. Washington, whose school included a photography department, right, well into the 20th century, that trained people in the art of photography. So I want to end now with some reflections on how this story is told in a more modern period. This, of course, is an image by Dorothea Lange. And for librarians and archivists, as well as historians, teachers, and those of us interested in this history, titles and naming are tremendously important. We know in the African American community our names are terribly important, right? Having that power to name yourself and name your children was tremendously important in marking people's freedom. This image is titled Mississippi Negress Holding Cotton. She was born a slave. right? So we are not given through the title, right, from Library of Congress, any personal information about this woman. I'm going to jump ahead here. Oh, here we go. Likewise, this image comes from the archives in Missouri. And the title that the archives gave this image is Portrait of a Well-Dressed Woman Believed to be a House Servant. So I'm going to pause for a second and ask you to look at the picture carefully and ask yourselves, is this a woman who defines herself as somebody's servant? No, right? It's so clearly not. Here's a young woman who's gone to the studio. She has put on her best clothes. If you look at it closely, she's wearing some gold jewelry. She's picked this sort of romantic, fuzzy, gauzy background to stand on. Right? Her sense of self bears no relation to the title that her image was given when it was archived, when it was saved. And I think for all of us who do research with sources, who go into the libraries, go into the archives, that's a question we need to ask ourselves, right? Who has titled this document? Who has named this person? So with that in mind, I want to end with a couple of family portraits. This is a portrait from Montana of a woman named Emma Smith. We know in Montana, African-American photographers, somewhat roughly, proliferated during the late 19th and early 20th century. And here she is, right, a free woman posing with her own children. Those are some more children. Here we go. This is Mrs. Minerva Graves, a former slave posing with her freeborn grandchildren in Macon, Georgia. It's a studio portrait, so she paid to have this picture made. And so I would remind you of that first picture I showed you of Dolly, and the idea of having to hold someone else's child on your lap and pose for the picture of your owner, right, as sort of the human chair for their child. And what that experience must have been like for somebody like Dolly. And then contrast it with what this experience of having her own portrait made, right, of Mrs. Graves, going to the photographer's studio with her grandchildren, her freeborn grandchildren, this woman who had survived slavery, right, to go to the studio and pause with her grandchildren on her lap and have that be the story that she told to her grandchildren and to her family about who she was and what freedom looked like for her, right, is a very different story than what some of those antebellum images and what some of those wartime images would tell us about what freedom and emancipation's legacies looked like. Thank you.
The tone,
Ask the questions quickly. There'll probably still be some sprinkles left. Okay, so if you make your way to the microphone, I'm happy to tell you whatever I can.
Hi, Jim Paradise, Abington, Pennsylvania. One of the photos that you showed brings back to mind a famous pair of photos of a young escaped slave. He shows up in one picture in tattered clothes, and the other one he's in a crisp uniform and a little boy. Jackson, I think was his name.
Yep.
Can you explain the context of this? Was this taken as a public relations effort?
That's a good question. So like that picture that I showed you of Gordon with the whip-scarred back, right, there's a sense among many sympathetic viewers, right, that circulating these images, right, is good PR, right, for the Union cause. There's also a sense that it will arouse sympathy, right, that in fact, part of the thinking is this is the way of presenting former slaves as people, right, as human beings with their own histories, with their own lives, with their own identities. And I don't disagree with that. What I find sort of troubling at a larger sort of philosophical level is that, and somebody recently said to me, right, if you think about sort of all of those, Red Cross fundraising, it's not fair to put the Red Cross on the line here, all those humanitarian fundraising photographs, right, it's always a poor child from Africa, right, with a fly on their right, it's always a picture of a battered body, right, it's not a picture of a resilient person. But so I think that I know that pair that you're talking about, and I think it's in that same vein of sort of showing the before and after of the potential. Yes, sir, we'll alternate here.
Paul Seidel, Cleveland, Ohio.
I just wonder, did anyone ever discover the fate of any of these people that were pictured in your photos?
So that's a good question. We looked for Dolly strenuously and could not find her. I know a couple of genealogists who continue to insist to me that they can find her, and I'm willing to issue the challenge to anyone if they want to find her. There's some people whose fate is known, and we write a little bit about them. And there's some, who are just lost to us as far as we know. And, in fact, that's what made the image of Dolly so captivating, right? That it really was haunting, that the reason we know about her and about her story of self-liberation is because her former master really couldn't let go, right? Couldn't even let go of that picture, right? Had to save it.
I'm Matt Robbins from New York City. I was wondering, a lot of these photos seem to sort of reflect like a portrait style, the sort of like, you were talking about refinement before, and it's sort of like reflecting that sort of like the way that white people would almost take photographs before the war. So I was wondering if there was like a development of a unique style among African-American photographers, and also was there African-American photography used as art more than a sense of refinement or like familial photos?
That's a good question, thank you. Certainly during that Civil War era, right, the style of the photographs is very common, right, sort of ubiquitous. And in part, I think it represents both that sort of where ideas about art and culture and photography are in general at that time. I think there's also a very clear political undercurrent to some of that, right, as somebody like Douglass would have said, right, about presenting yourself on par with the greatest leaders and the greatest thinkers. I think the period where you see the big sort of aesthetic shift doesn't come until the era of the Harlem Renaissance, right? And really with people like Van der Zee and other prominent African-American photographers who really then are steeped in sort of showcasing African-American culture in all of its richness and diversity in a way that I think the political circumstances are so different in that Civil War and post-Civil War moment.
Yes, Lee Fisher from Oxford, Ohio. The early photographs of the black ladies with white children, I think it's been pretty well documented that a lot of those ladies stayed with those families for a long time, some of them even after the war, because they had no other option. Are you suggesting that all of those photographs were staged and those women actually had no affection for those little kids?
So that's a couple of different questions. Let me try to pull this apart a little bit. Certainly in terms of economic options, right, we know that many former slaves did not have a wealth of opportunity and resources ahead of them. We also know that until the 1960s, right, domestic service was the #1 occupation for African-American women in this country. The photographs certainly are staged, and I think the different question to ask is, would those women have preferred to be in a photograph with their own family members? Right? Would they, if they had the opportunity to create a photograph, would it have included their family members rather than, in which case they wouldn't be presented as the servant, right, but as the member. I think the question of affection is a different one, right? And I mean, I will say, they're human beings, right? How could you not, they're sentient as anybody else. So,
well, I was just looking for data to support the fact that you feel that they were all staged.
Well, the portraits are staged, right? Because you have to go into the photographer's studio, right? You're going to choose your clothes, you're going to choose your backdrop, you're going to choose the composition of who's sitting where. So they're staged in that sense.
Right.
And by including your slave or servant, right, you're creating a particular kind of image about how you want to present yourself, right? If these are images you're going to share with family and friends, right? You put on your best clothes, right? You don't put on your work pants, right? Even though everybody knows you have work pants, right? You put on your best clothes because you're creating a certain kind of story about yourself and your family that includes your servants.
Hi.
Hi.
You mentioned with great power images from Emancipation celebrations and United States CT troops. What are good archives to find those pictures? Present, say, in classrooms or in public history places to counter the image of the poor slave or the wretched slave?
Thank you. That's a great question. The best resource is Library of Congress. Library of Congress has an amazing photo archive. You can download onto your own computer for free and use them in the classroom. There's some archives that will also then ask you to pay a $10,000 fee to produce them. That's a different story.
Hi, my name is Barbara Krauthamer. I'm from Richmond, New Jersey. As a student of a high school art history class, I was kind of taught to interpret photos in their context. But also as a high school student, modern photography is really nothing like 19th century photography. So I was just wondering if in making this book, did you develop a sort of eye for the portraits of the period? Is there a difference? Like, how does one kind of acquire that taste? I know it's a very esoteric question, but...
So there's a lot of terrific scholarship on photographic photography, the culture of photography, and sort of the norms and context, right? So again, why people pose certain ways in those studio portraits in that mid-19th century moment, right? It's for Douglass, that picture of Douglass, right? He's looking off to the side. He's not looking directly at the camera because he's posing like a classical statesman, right? You don't stare at the camera and smile, you know, the way we all do now, right, when we pop out our phones, right? It's a totally, exactly, and so it's a totally different context, totally different culture, totally different meanings about what that image was supposed to do.
Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Lee Elder from Talmadge, Ohio. And just to sort of support what you were saying about photographs being staged, there was an equipment limitation in those days that we don't have now. You can't move, you gotta sit straight, and nothing else is gonna move. So that's, I think that kind of goes along with what you were saying.
Right, and that's why there are all those blurry patches, right? Because the children in all those Emancipation Day celebrations, there's always a blur at the front of the picture, because the children don't stand still.
My kids never stayed still.
Last one, yeah. I know, Sprinkles are calling us.
Yeah, so everybody can get to the ice cream just quickly. You talked about Frederick Douglass recognizing the importance of photographs and Booker T. Washington offering courses on photography. Martin Luther King also recognized the importance of getting things on film.
Yeah.
Could you just talk about quickly the importance of that developing into the 20th century as film came along?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think you answered your own question very nicely, right? I mean, that I think that idea of representing yourself, right? Not photography as documentation, but as self-representation was, you know, terrifically important through the Civil Rights Movement, and then the images, not unlike that scarred back picture, right? Those images of hoses and dogs, right, are really powerful in a different way from the written text. Thank you.
Before you all make the mad rush for Mr. G's ice cream, I do have one quick announcement. If any of you